So for the sermon today, I had a really clever introduction picked out. I mean, stick figures and my weird sense of humor and everything. Then Jim Cantori showed up in Wilmington. And Florence narrowed its path, aiming directly at the town that we had moved here from. That red arrow is pointing basically at our house there. And so coming here, we couldn't sell our house in North Carolina, so we've been renting it. And all of a sudden, we start wondering, what will our insurance cover? What if it gets flooded? What happens if we lose everything? And so the storm is heading in. We call in a friend to, go take the before pictures, hoping that there's not going to be a very different set of after pictures. You watch the evacuations, and suddenly familiar locations are in the headlines. Words like worst ever and once in a lifetime get thrown around, and you're just watching and waiting and praying. I was typing this out on Wednesday, thinking it would be easier if the thing just hit already, rather than all of this waiting. Just let it happen or not happen. Let's get on with it. Waiting is hard when the stakes are high and the outcome is uncertain. We don't control the storm, but we do control our own response. I'm not talking about the idiots out there surfing the storm surge, which they do. Or even that guy who went out there, and I saw a video of mine, he strapped a parachute to a chair in a parking lot and became a hood ornament. What I mean is, there's a particular temptation that comes with trials and with waiting and how we deal with it. So open with me to 1 Samuel chapter 13. Halfway through the book of 1 Samuel, there's a transition. For the first time in their history, God's chosen people who he had brought out of slavery in Egypt, they say, God, I know you're supposed to be our true king and ruler, but we want a king like all the other people. So God says, all right, and he gives them a king, choosing Saul. And at this point, Saul has been king for 2 years. And essentially, his first real action as king is he goes and he picks a fight with the Philistines, their traditional enemies in the area. And this is what happens next. 1 Samuel 13, verse 5. And the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen and troops like the sand on the seashore in multitude. Now Saul's gone and poked a bear here. Not only did these people have the number advantage, they had advanced technology. Chariots at that time were like tanks and terrifying to fight against. And not just that they had chariots and their troops like sand on the shore. At that time, they controlled the blacksmiths. And in the entire Israelite army, only Saul and his son had even a sword or a spear. Everybody else is armed literally with sticks and stones, and they're waiting now. And you need to understand that before you begin to judge what he's about to do. Because temptation will hit you in the middle of a struggle like it would never bother you when everything is fine. It's like somebody who puts up their house to back a new business, and then it's a few years in, and all they've seen is red, and they're at risk of losing everything they've ever worked for. There's a church in North Carolina. They had their treasurer steal some $20,000 from them. Over the course of a few years, you see she was having a hard time paying for health insurance. And so she just took a little bit out of here and a little bit here. She really intended to pay it back, but when people are in desperate situations, they do desperate things. So here's what happens in verse 6. When the men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, for the people were hard pressed, the people hid themselves in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and cisterns. And some Hebrews crossed the fords of the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. So basically what the people just did on coastal North Carolina is they either went to ground into hiding, and some of them were fleeing the country, altogether. And just like we would look at people who stay behind, we're going to ride the hurricane out and say, oh, you fool! People are basically saying the same thing to Saul as he prepares to fight an enemy that vastly outmatches him. Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. He waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. See, Saul goes into this with the right idea in mind. Everyone is terrified, and they're running, and Saul says, no, we're going to wait. Samuel promised me he would come here, and he's going to come here, and he's going to bless the troops. And so he waits with expectation. 7 days. And every single day, more people are leaving. His army is getting smaller, and the other army is getting bigger, and he waits. He doesn't show up. And he starts to get concerned, and yeah, he made that promise that he'd be here, but what happens if he doesn't come? These people aren't going to fight if they don't feel God is backing him, and what if he pulls a Lucas? It doesn't show at the appointed time. So he says, I'll do it myself. What do we do when God doesn't seem to show up? You've been there, you've been praying for something, and you might have even felt that God had promised you that he would respond in a certain way. And you're waiting, and then the time comes, it feels like God doesn't show up. Abraham, the forefather of our faith, as he told repeatedly in the Bible, he's called that. He and Sarah struggled with the same thing. God promised to make a nation from them. And then Sarah doesn't get pregnant. I mean, can you imagine the initial anticipation? Like, all right, man, hey, he's going to give us a kid. All right, God can do it. Doesn't happen. Maybe it'll happen when we get to the land. They get to the land. All right, we're in the land that God has promised to us and our descendants forever, except we're the descendants. Now we're here, and what's going to happen? Anytime now, God. If you've had fertility issues, you know the heartache of waiting month after month for something that never arrives. They waited 10 years in the land. 10 years and no kids. And so they go and say, well, maybe we need to redefine God's promise to us. And Sarah said to Abraham, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. Did you hear the change there? It went from God promised us kids to now Sarah is saying God is actively preventing the very thing he promised to us. And that's what it feels like sometimes, as though God is actively working against you. So she says, go and sleep with my servant. Take her on as like a secondary wife. It was common practice at the time, and maybe that's the way God's promise is going to work out. God's delays do not mean no. Christine's at the age where, she'll ask me for something, I'm like, oh, I'll think about it, or maybe she's like, you just mean no, don't you? You're on to it. And sometimes with God, we need to adjust our timelines. I mean, we're used to, tracking packages, and isn't that a magical thing? You put in that number, it tells you exactly, you can track it. It's in Memphis now, and it's out for delivery. Don't you wish prayers worked like that? Put in a prayer request number and say, okay, prayer's been received by God, it's gone through processing, and I've got a blessing out for delivery. Should be here by tomorrow. And some of you you're praying for God to save your family members. And it's been years. And I know how it works. Your prayers change, right? You got somebody who's struggling and, God stepped into their life, and then when it's been 5 years, your prayers aren't quite the same. I mean, God is just as capable of stepping into that person's life at any time, but human nature is we tend to assume that he's less likely to act the longer we wait. I've been there. Here's the truth. God's promises do not lose any of their power over time. 10 years of waiting did not make God any less likely to give Abraham and Sarah a kid. In fact, it was another 14 years after that point that God did give them a kid. Do you think he was trying to make a point to them? And we look back on this now, right? We look at Abraham and Sarah and we marvel at, well, how come they didn't believe God? How could she tell him to go and sleep with her servant? How could they not believe? But when you're in the middle of it, it's a whole lot different. But Saul, he didn't wait 10 years or 14 years. He really couldn't even wait for the evening. You know, Samuel said, hey, I'll be there on the 7th day. And it's like halfway through the 7th day. And he's like, he's not coming. One of my most intense memories from childhood. I was waiting for my dad to get home from work. And you know the light brights? The little artwork things you do with the little colored light bulbs. I made one for my dad. And I'm waiting for him to get home. And you know, he works for the FBI and he works some late nights, and it was getting dark outside. And I just hit this point and I snapped. I was like 7-year-old, like, Dad is never coming home, ever! And I was like tearing the light bulbs out of it, just convinced that my dad was literally never going to arrive at home. We do the same thing. Over dumb stuff, right? Your package, if it's scheduled for morning delivery, some of you are ready to call Amazon headquarters because it's 12:05. Not here, and Sarah's home with the kids sick, so I can't look directly at her. But I'll be honest, I'm a lot closer to Saul than Abraham when it comes to it. 1 Samuel 13:9. So Saul said, Samuel's not coming. Bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. See, Sarah tried to help God out by giving Abraham another wife. Saul tries to seek God's favor by doing it himself. You see, only priests were supposed to offer these things. And Saul had been told specifically to wait for Samuel to arrive. In both of these situations, they hit a point where they said, it's up to me now. Let me tell you, in your hour of need, you will either turn to God or you will turn to other things. And this is where addictions lurk. You know how many times I've talked to people who are trying to get clean and they set something aside and then their life is still struggling and it's still hard and they're saying, where is the joy that was promised to me? Right? I'm working a job and I'm trying to do things the right way, and why is it still hard? And for $25, I can go 2 doors down and I can escape for a day because it's easy. I turn to cheap distractions on my phone when things get difficult. When I can't solve the problems right in front of me, it's easy just to turn to it because it's right there. Let me tell you, guys, especially those video games that you play, they are a substitute. They're like an achievement drug. They give you the sense of having completed something when you're just spinning your wheels. If your marriage is struggling, that hidden browser on your phone offers an easy release, but it's not the joy that God's promised you. It's so easy to turn to things even that aren't sinful. And those times when we're waiting and we don't see a way out. We turn to other sources of joy to relieve our suffering, and we turn to other sources of power to fix our problems. I think that when C.S. Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, he had that particular passage in 1 Samuel in mind in the book Prince Caspian. There's a point in the book where Prince Caspian, the good guy, is arguing with his advisors about what to do. They're trying to fight the enemy, and they keep on losing, fight after fight. And the character Nickabrick, he states their condition. To speak plainly, says Nickabrick, your wallet's empty, your eggs addled, your fish uncaught, your promises broken. Stand aside then and let others work. Some of the others disagree. I stand by Aslan, have patience like us beasts, the help will come. It may even now be at the door. Pah, snarled Nickabrick, your badgers would have us wait till the sky falls and we can all catch larks. I tell you, we can't wait. Food is running short, we lose more than we can afford at every encounter. Our followers are slipping away. So then he goes and he introduces some evil friends of his. A hag and a werewolf who pledged to fight for them, and even to bring back the White Witch. They're powerful, he says, and they could use power. They say she ruled for 100 years, 100 years of winter. There's power, if you like. There's something practical. You see, in their hour of need, and when they didn't see another way out, their fears are legitimate. And yet their fears drive them to the brink of accepting something that is evil because it promises them a way out. Now, I'm not saying that in the middle of your struggle, I really think people in this church are like going and saying, Satan, please help me. And yet, I've often seen godly people turning to worldly ways to solve their problems the way everybody else does. People saying things like, well, we've tried the nice way. Now it's time to do something practical. Let's do something that really works. Proverbs 20:22 says, do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord, and he will deliver you. There is never a point at which we say, well, I've tried things God's way, like turning the other cheek, and it hasn't worked, and so now I'm going to take things into my own hands. Instead, we're told to suffer while we wait for God to take action. Well, that's not easy. You find this sentiment in the Psalms. Psalm 37. Be still before the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. For the evildoer shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. See, it's so easy when people are evil to you and you're in that time and you're like waiting for the justice that you expect to happen to arrive, but it doesn't. And so we want to take things into our own hands. And hey, half the cop movies ever made start like that, don't they? In a world where justice doesn't happen, one man is willing to take things into his own hands. And he goes outside the bounds of the law. And he goes and he takes revenge. You know what a Christian movie would look like that? Justice doesn't come. They forgive the people who wronged them. They wait and they die and they spend all of eternity with God forever and ever. And on that day, justice is done when the person who wronged them stands before God and has to give an account for their actions. But it makes for kind of a boring movie. Saul needed to wait the 7 days for Samuel's promised arrival. Understand that the justice you're waiting for is not promised to arrive in this lifetime. We're looking forward to the day that Jesus comes back, and then everything's going to be made right. Then the lost will be found, and the hungry will be fed. But you don't see that yet. Can you imagine? You decide not to wait, and you're in the middle of taking revenge, and you're really letting that person have it. You're telling them exactly what you think they ought to hear. And Jesus comes back at that very moment. It'd be kind of awkward. Well, you see, Jesus, I was just doing what you were literally about to do. I was trying to give them what they deserved, even though that's technically your job, and now you're here, so that's kind of awkward. This is how Saul felt because Samuel comes back right as he finishes offering the offerings. waiting. He's not coming. I'm going to do it. And he just finishes, and there's Samuel. And what do you say to him then? Samuel said to Saul, "You've done foolishly. You've not kept the command of the Lord your God with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you've not kept what the Lord commanded you." 2 years in, and he's already told that because he refused to wait for God, he would lose the very thing that God had given him. Abram and Sarah experienced heartache in the fallout of their decisions when they didn't wait for God. So how do we avoid this broken road? We need to understand that their sin started not with taking another wife, not with going and offering the sacrifices he wasn't supposed to offer. Their sin started in their hearts. It began with worry. Now you might be saying, "Oh man, that's a lot harder. Like I'm pretty sure I can successfully avoid sleeping with my neighbor's wife, or stepping into things that I shouldn't step into and offer sacrifices on my own." But worry, man, that's my bread and butter. If they had an Olympic event in worrying, I'd carry the gold and the silver. But here's the thing, worry at its center is an attitude that says, this is up to me. God doesn't have this. Now again, sometimes people say, well, you see, I've got to be prepared. There's a difference between being prepared and worrying. Right? We were prepared as much as we could be for the hurricane. We took pictures of the house. We checked in with our tenants. They were fortunately evacuated. We did all of those things. And we were concerned. You can't help but be concerned when stuff is going wrong in your life. Some of you've waited for a biopsy result. And you're not sinning against God if you're like, "Oh, I don't care either way. It's fine." No, you're going to be concerned. But the difference is, and the difference I've been struggling with all week, is to take up with my heart those struggles as if it were up to me. To begin thinking, "Oh man, what if this happens? And I gotta try and figure out a way to make our retirement plans work if that house isn't even there. Tomorrow I've got to figure out how we're gonna handle this, and what if that happens, and how are we gonna do this?" And figuring "Oh man, can I just call up Ted and say, 'Hey Ted, let's go on a road trip and put a roof back on our house.'" And that worry, though, and I knew that that's what I had to fight against. Because all of that, the heart of it was saying that God is not in control. And so I got to worry and stress as though I am. But Psalm said, "Don't fret, it leads only to evil." Philippians 4, 6 and 7. Do not be anxious about anything. Now, if you just left it there, you feel like telling the sky not to be blue. Might as well tell the sun not to rise. Tell the Browns to win a game for once. It says, don't be anxious about anything, but, and here is the way out of this, in everything, so in every situation when we find ourselves worrying, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. It's not just that we're saying, "God, I'm in a bad spot. God, I need you to step through. God, here are my needs." But we're also to have, in that moment, in our anxiety, an attitude of thankfulness. Let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. See, God grants a peace if we're willing in those times of waiting, so that even when it doesn't make sense, even when your army is scattering behind you, and the answer hasn't shown up, that you can say, "I don't understand, but I know that God has this." Sometimes you've done everything you can do, and that's where I find it the hardest. It's not where like, oh, I know exactly what I have to do, it's just hard. It's where the situation is totally out of your control, and I can't make the rain stop falling. And you just need to sit still and shut up and let God do his thing. And that's actually literally what God tells Israel at one point. The book of Exodus, he leads them, right? He's taking them out of slavery, and he leads them, and he pins them on purpose between a sea on one side and the Egyptian army on the other. And they start freaking out now. Oh God, we should have gone back to Egypt. And he tells them this: the Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent. So some of you, you're in the middle of something and you can do nothing about it. So you're searching for something you can do, and sometimes God's response to you is just stop struggling and trust me. Because, you see, God had put them in that situation to show his power to them. God waited decades to give Abraham and Sarah children to show his faithfulness. He wanted to show Saul that he was always exactly on time. And God wants to demonstrate the same thing to you today. Now, as I speak, as far as we can tell, our house is intact. No major wind damage, and the floodwaters haven't reached it. But here's the thing. Whether or not my house is still standing at the end of the day is a secondary matter. All week, I've been telling myself, what really matters is my faith intact at the end of the day? Have I honored God even in times of uncertainty? Have I been willing just to wait and trust him and to wait and see what he would do? Trusting that house or no house, health or no health, job or no job, whatever the circumstances, he's going to come through. And I want him to grow my faith through those times and in those times. Because let me tell you, I haven't found for me personally that my faith has grown a whole lot when God solves all my problems like 30 minutes from the time that they start. I mean, I've been thankful, yeah. But in terms of learning endurance, if you want to run a marathon, it's going to take some time. There's only one way to train for it. And we look back on those things differently than we experience them. So what I want to have, right, is the kind of faith that I trust God as much in the moment as I can praise him after he comes through. I've never looked back on my life and said, you know what, man, I trusted God a little bit too much. I should have panicked a little bit more. I have looked back and said, how could I not see the way that he would come through? Let's pray. God, sometimes we don't know the way. And all we see are disaster reports incoming, and the rain is falling, and the winds are picking up, and there's a storm surge coming, and every hour by hour it feels the waters rise, and they get a little bit higher, and we feel like we're treading water, and we wait for you. I pray that in those times that we bring our requests to you, that you would grant us that peace that nothing else can. There's a whole lot of other things that we can turn to provide distraction, to provide a false sense of security. But God, instead of running to anything or anyone else, drive us to the foot of your cross, because you were willing to die for us when we were your enemies. Now that we're your children, how much more will you give us? So I pray for those right now that are in that time of waiting. Help us to fight against our worry as our chief enemy. To trust you, to glorify you while we wait. In Jesus' name.